Hi there. Welcome to or welcome back to Tiff Reads Books, where I read books and then I talk to you about them. Today I have two short horror books that I want to talk to you about that one of them has come out recently and the other is going to come out recently. The other is going to come out soon, and I just think that you should read them if you like short horror, which I'm finding works really well for me right now. So the first book I'm going to talk to you about, I got approved from NetGalley on short notice, so I had to squeeze it into my reading schedule, and I want to make sure I get a video out to you before it comes out so that you can go and pick it up when it releases. So this releases on March 19th, and it is The Woods All Black by Lee Mandelo. And this was fantastic. I do have like a couple of qualms that I'll give you at the end where it knocked it down from a 5-star to a 4.5. Because there were couple of things didn't work for me, so very personal reasons why I marked it down, but I do think overall the book is fantastic. It is well written. The plot keeps going. There are some areas that if it was going to be a full length could have been fleshed out, but in the form that it works in, there was enough information given to really follow what was happening, and I really enjoyed that aspect of it. Something that I think is a little hard to do in short form is to make sure that you're explaining everything, especially when you have a supernatural element that this book has. So this book does have a supernatural element. So we are following Leslie Bruin, who is a nurse with the Frontier Nursing Service, or the FNS, which places nurses in the rural areas of the U.S., from what I could pick up from the book. And their job is to go out and vaccinate and perform some midwifery duties. And Les has been working with them since he came back from France after World War I, where he was in the trenches as a nurse. So Les was assigned female at birth and is now a closeted trans man in 1920s. So obviously we're starting off with some discomfort in this horror novel. And immediately when Les steps off the train, he is misgendered by the man that greets him. And so I'm going to give you the warning now. I will use he, him pronouns throughout, but the book consistently, for plot reasons and for story reasons, misgenders Les. So if you are sensitive about that and that's not something you enjoy reading or want to read even as part of your horror, I would recommend not reading this book because he is consistently misgendered throughout it. It does add to the horror element. It gives you the sense of what Les is going through and what he has to deal with on a daily basis in this world that he is existing in and trying to survive in. So Les has been invited to this town by the town council, and there's a bit of a weird thing where he does not feel very welcome in this town. He's immediately greeted with some sneering faces and snide remarks and comments on his appearance and his manner of dress, as he is wearing trousers. He did ride in on a horse, and trousers make it a lot easier to ride a horse, so he's able to use that as a little bit of an excuse in order to get some good graces in the town, but it takes a little bit of time, and he still does not. They look at him as an outcast, and the synopsis says that they look at him as a failed woman. And this is kind of the overarching pronunciations are. This is like the crux of the issue. Is there's a preacher in this town who does not like it when people who appear female don't do as they should do. And this is where we have the part of the horror that I was really able to identify with. As I'm not part of the trans community, I can't really identify with what it feels like to constantly have that daily horror of not being able to be yourself, not being addressed in the appropriate way, and the fear for your life that can come in many situations. But I did grow up in an evangelical household with this type of sermons that we get, and so when we get our first glimpse into the sermon from this preacher, Holiday, he is very much the type of person that I grew up getting sermons from, and it was the type of sermon that I'm used to seeing, and it was a little overwhelming, and I definitely got quite a bit of fear for Les and his safety. And I was like, oh, this is not the place to be. And I was like, okay, we're setting this tone immediately where we are just constantly worried for Les's safety. And it's one of those, boy, get yourself gone, because this is not a safe place to be. And you're just constantly telling the character, don't do that, just leave. But the reason Les doesn't just leave is that he is kind of on this reconnaissance mission that he's given himself to look kind of in the underground areas of the towns and find people that are, in his words, a little bit like him, that might not fit with what society expects and might do with a safer area or some outreach in ways that they can manage their safety in these environments. So he really wants to do that, and that is like kind of his goal. So with all of that going on, Les does find a young person that he feels some kinship with. He's not exactly sure what's going on with this person, who goes by Stevie, about what type of reason he's feeling the kinship for, but he knows that this person is troubled and that Stevie is not quite fitting in with the town, and there are other things going on around Stevie that Les eventually picks up on and figures out. And on top of all of that, there is now a supernatural presence in the woods behind the cabin that Les is staying in, and he is feeling the fear from that, and it is triggering a lot of PTSD nightmares from his time in the trenches in World War I. So we have all of these different elements happening that create this tense environment, and Les refuses to leave until he can guarantee Stevie's safety. So the story revolves around this and the town, and it gets worse and worse until we get a very gratifying ending and culmination of everything that happened. It is horror, it is violent, there is a lot of blood, there is a lot of gore, and a definite religious overtone. So lots of different elements of horror, so keep those in mind. Check content warnings before you read the book if you are someone that needs to know what you're going to be presented with. And I will say, this is a mild spoiler. I'm not going to spoil anything about plot, but I am going to say for content-wise, there are two things in here that I was not aware of and I would have liked to have known going in. One is that we get some monster smut in this book, and I don't typically read that and was not expecting it. It is consensual, but it is monster smut, and it is graphic, and very graphic. So be prepared for that, because I was not, and when it started to happen, I was like, oh no, are we doing that? And I was like, okay, we're doing that. And it was a lot for me. I won't say it was like terribly written, but I was not expecting it. So the other aspect is that there is a bit of an age gap in a relationship, and while the relationship itself is consensual, I was a little uncomfortable with the age and experience gap and the insta-love of the relationship. So keep that in mind as well when you're reading it, if those are some things that bother you. Those are the two things that kind of brought it down a little bit for me. Overall, though, the book itself was really good, and had I have known to expect those things, the shock of them probably wouldn't have brought it down as much, maybe, or it would have been a different read for me. But I highly recommend it. It comes out again March 19th from Tor.com. The next one that I read is a Tor Nightfire. So Tor is just like killing it for me. So this is a Tor Nightfire book. It came out in February. It's called Your Shadow Half Remains. And this one, it says in the synopsis, is for people who like Bird Box and The Last of Us. I have not watched a horror movie since like Jeepers Creepers or White Noise was in theaters, whichever one was more recent. I was like 15, 16 when I stopped watching horror movies, because I get nightmares. So, but I can read horror books and I love them. So, anyway, I don't know what those two things are. I think Bird Box is the one with the blindfold, but I don't know what The Last of Us is. So, in this story, we are following Riley as she navigates a world with a ridiculous pandemic in which if you make eye contact with someone, you will fight them to the death, basically. Very bloody, very gory, very nasty ways people tend to die in this story. And so we do get a lot of that fresh from the beginning. We are following Riley as, because of this pandemic, she has isolated herself in a cabin on a lake that used to belong to her grandparents, and her grandparents killed each other in. So starting off with the trauma. And for some reason, Riley has thrown her phone into the lake, so she's kind of even more isolated than most people. And because of what's happening, food and everything started being delivered via drones. People don't really go anywhere very often, and when you do, you're wearing things like goggles or blinders or a blindfold so that you're not looking people in the eyes so that you don't snap and kill them. So Riley, one day, while she's out picking up her grocery delivery, gets approached. And this is something that people don't do right now, so she's immediately like, "Ooh, why? I'm uncomfortable," and drops her eyes to look at their boots. And so all we know of this person is that they're wearing boots. And then they introduce themselves as Ellis. And we get described like a husky, gravelly voice, and that's Ellis. So a couple of days go by, and Riley decides she's going to go over and talk to Ellis because the isolation is like getting to her, and she decides she's going to go do it. And we start to develop more of this like friendship, companionship type relationship between Riley and Ellis. And as this develops, something is fucking with Riley, and something is moving around her house at night. Something is in her house at night. Something is stalking her. Something is freaking her the fuck out. And she feels like she's starting to lose it. In addition, the birds start attacking her. So she has no idea what's going on, but because it all coincided with the appearance of Ellis, she's wondering if she can trust Ellis. And we get all of that developing from there. The story itself, there is a lot of like rage, there's a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of fear, there's a lot of tension. And it was one of those where when the reveal happens, I put it down and was like, oh my god, and just kind of like stared at the wall for a little bit and then finished the book out. It does end on an ambiguous note. So if ambiguous endings in horror books bother you, you're going to be bothered by this one because it is pretty ambiguous in the way that it ends. And you have to kind of piece it together through yourself. It doesn't tell you what happened. You have to piece it together. And then we don't know what happens from the final scene. But I do like horror that ends that way because it makes you continuously think about it and makes you kind of question things. This book, one of the things I do want to talk about it that I think is really, really interesting is something that Sunny Moraine did. Because Ellis is never described with a gender. We always just have the pronoun be the name, which is really interesting. And our one description of Ellis is we have the boots and the voice, and then we have a time where Riley is walking behind Ellis in the woods, and we get I saw like a broad back and a tapered waist with a brown belt and jeans and boots. That could be literally anybody. Like, it's very interesting that you have no description. And I find it fascinating that this gets tagged as sapphic a lot when we don't have the actual description of Ellis, which is a very gender neutral name. And I kind of loved that. It's just there's so much ambiguity about this. Ellis does bring up a past relationship, and it's all they, them. It's always they left, they didn't want to, I couldn't do that to them, which is, again, just incredibly ambiguous. And having a personal anecdote here, when I first met my boyfriend and he would mention his exes, he would say, oh, they did this or they did that. And I was like, at one point I was like, is there a reason why you keep using they? And he's like, oh, well, I just figured you didn't want to know names, so I just used they instead. And I'm like, okay. Because I was like, are you trying to tell me something? I was so confused. So I've met people that have just used they because they don't want to get into details of their exes. So the ambiguity of all of the whole story just keeps flowing. The only person that we know a lot about is Riley, and we know everything from her very limited perspective. So that just kind of adds into this like very interesting thing that you can kind of interpret Ellis as whoever you want Ellis to be, and that is very interesting to me. So yeah, that is some of my thoughts, as well as the synopsis of Your Shadow Half Remains, which came out last month in February. We are now in March already halfway through March, actually. So that's what I've been reading for short horror. I have a short horror coming up that I'm really excited about. I'm going to read a short science fiction horror thriller novel, and I'll talk to you about that one when I come around to it. This is my next book. I'm going to start it this afternoon, so that's why it's sitting back there. I'm moving to some sci-fi. So I will talk to you very soon with something else.